I wonder how you respond when people say to you, I don't believe God exists because of all the suffering in the world. I remember very clearly a bit ago, actually, I was staring at these chapters for something else. And that particular week, a friend of mine lost his job. Thank you for working with us for 20 years, but don't bother to come in tomorrow morning. That very same week, a friend of mine told me about his daughter's cancer. And then Sarah came home one evening, having just taken the funeral of a 3-month-old little girl called Chloe. But I don't need to tell you this, do I? Because each of you will have similar stories. There isn't a single one of us in this building who isn't affected in some way by suffering. What does God have to say about suffering? Well, this summer, this autumn, we're looking at the very last book in the Bible. It's a book that people tend to shy away from because it's full of pictures and images that we need quite hard, we need to work quite hard to get our minds around. But it's actually a book that I don't think that tells us anything new that isn't written about elsewhere in the Bible, but it does show us things from a different perspective. Most of us, probably all of us here, are familiar with the 4 Gospels, the 4 accounts of Jesus when he was on earth. But Revelation is it's a revelation. It's a vision of what is going on in heaven now. Now that Jesus has lived and died and risen from the dead and returned to heaven, what is going on today in heaven? Heaven, the place where God is, where the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is. So far in the book of Revelation, we've learnt that John, the person that this vision was given to, is describing what he is seeing in heaven. And because he's describing the almost indescribable, the almost unimaginable, he is using picture language. And what we're now seeing in these chapters is something like, and this is my language rather than the Bible's language, something like God's supreme command center. If I went to a historian, and I said to them, can you explain the Second World War to me? Possibly that historian would say, okay, well, let's go to a museum together. Let's go to the Imperial War Museum, somewhere like that. And maybe he would take me to one of those rooms, and you've seen these on the films, maybe you've seen them at museums, a sort of room which is a sort of mock-up of a command centre. You know what I mean? Whether it's Hitler's command centre or Churchill's command centre or maybe one of the general's command centres. And in those rooms, you see, don't you? You see maps laid out on tables, and you see symbols that represent armies and divisions and strategic places. And maybe on these mock-ups you see these great arrows representing troop movements, that sort of thing. And seeing all of this and understanding the symbols and the maps and the models would maybe just give me some understanding of the sweep of the Second World War. And in a sense, that's what we've got in Revelation. Last week in chapter 4, and do listen to that sermon online if you missed it. Last week in chapter 4, we were introduced to God and his ruling council in his command centre. And last week we saw him holding a scroll, holding a book. Maybe if this vision was today, we'd have said maybe holding a computer program or a computer file, representing God's plans for the whole, not of the Second World War, his plans for the whole of world history. But the problem we saw last week, that this scroll had 7 seals round it, a legal document with seals, 7 seals around it that prevented it from being opened. And then last week we saw the Lord Jesus himself represented figuratively as a lamb taking the scroll. And today we see him opening the seals on the scroll. So what we have here, the picture of God's command centre, in a way, isn't dissimilar to what you would see at the Imperial War Museum. And each of these 7 seals representing a significant part of world cosmic history. Is that sort of making sense? Yeah, nod at me if it's making sense? Yeah, great. Okay, so what are these 7 significant events that the Bible tells us? Just to warn you, there are lots of symbols. We haven't got time to explore anywhere near all of them, so I'm just going to mention what I think are the key symbols that we see in these couple of chapters. Chapter 6, verse 1, John tells us, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So we have a white horse that is followed by seal number 2, which is a red horse. Seal number 3 is a black horse, and seal number 4 is a pale horse. Verse 7, when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. What do the 4 horses stand for? Well, we are told they were given power over a quarter of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. A quarter of the earth, in other words, a very significant number of people directly affected by death from war or famine or pestilence or wild beasts. This is suffering, isn't it? This is what it's talking about. This is talking about suffering. For whatever reason, this sweep of world history contains significant suffering. Should we be surprised? Well, no, of course we shouldn't. We know this already. This is part of our everyday experience. This is part of what we see when we turn on the news at 10 o'clock. Actually, we should be very worried indeed if the Bible didn't mention suffering. If there was no mention of significant and sustained personal and global suffering within God's command room, if there's no mention of it, then we'd say this is rubbish, this isn't true to life. We can't trust this is fiction. But maybe we are surprised, and maybe we are even slightly uncomfortable with the fact that these verses tell us again and again what the rest of the Bible tells us, that this suffering is Jesus authorized. Let me just say that again, because I think our tendency is to shy away from that truth. Jesus does not merely allow suffering in the world. Jesus does not merely permit suffering in this world. He actively authorizes it. Let me just go back to last week, to chapters 4 and 5. We saw there God is in the business of creating a perfect eternity, a perfect new creation for his people. That is his end goal. And the thing that jeopardizes that is my rebellion and your rebellion and the collective rebellion of the world against God's good ways. That's the thing that puts God's perfect plan at risk. And we saw last week, if you were here, we saw John weeping. We saw him weeping and weeping and weeping because he thought that God's good plan couldn't happen. But we saw last week that the Lord Jesus Christ is the key to that plan. And we're seeing that within God's good plan, 7 things that will happen in world history. And those first 4 things, the Lord Jesus authorizing suffering. The Lord Jesus judging that suffering is his righteous response to a sinful world. In any justice system, crime and punishment, they go together. And in God's system of justice, sin and judgment go together. Verse 8, please would you note verse 8, because these words are so important. These picture language, I know it's picture language, these horsemen, they are wreaking havoc. But verse 8, please note, they were given power. Their activity is explicitly authorized by the Lord Jesus. So my first heading this morning, reflecting those seals 1 to 4, the suffering in the world. My second heading, seal number 5, speaks of the suffering of Christians. Verse 9 speaks of Christians in heaven. Today there are Christians in heaven. Of course, today there are Christians in heaven. God's people who have already left this earth. What are they doing? Verse 10, they called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Lord, how long is this suffering on earth going to keep going? How long are you going to let people get away with this? Again, this is unsurprising, isn't it? Because that's what I guess you and I do, don't we? We turn on our TVs and we see yet another famine, we see yet another genocide, we see yet another act of terrorism, we see yet another murder, we see yet another rape, we see yet... And we go, don't we cry? Don't we cry? How long? Lord, how long? Why are you continuing to let this happen? When are you going to stop this? And when are you going to act in judgment against those who have perpetrated these things? And more specifically, if you look closely at these verses later, you'll see that these Christians who are now in heaven are crying out, yes, in respect of the suffering and injustice generally in the world, but especially they are crying out in respect of God's people who have suffered and been persecuted. And again, don't we do that? Don't we especially do that? When we hear of some Christian missionary that has been beheaded, don't we say, Lord, this is one of your people. When are you going to do something about this? Don't we say that? Seals 1 and 4. These are events in world history. The 4 horsemen, pictures of suffering and death, but authorized by the Lord Jesus himself. Seal number 5, Christians in heaven crying out for justice, as do we. All of which is happening at the present. Today, in this world, there is Jesus' authorized suffering. Today, in heaven, there are Christians crying out, how long? But then seal 6 and our camera shot of heaven moves from the present and moves to the future. What deep down we all want, what we know is right and just, finally will happen. Verse 12. When he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood. Just as with all the other events that we've talked about, this is a real event that will happen, but it's merely using picture language. And the real event that the Bible is talking about here, it calls the Day of Judgment, which is the final day of world history, where the King of this world, the Lord Jesus Christ himself, will judge all people according to their actions. And if a good and loving God exists, that is a good thing, isn't it? It must be right that he holds people to account, mustn't it? People say, why doesn't God merely forget about it, brush it under the carpet? I don't know what you think. What sort of God would he be like if when you said to him, so what are you going to do about those people who peddle drugs? What are you going to do about those people who blow up shopping centres? What are you going to do about those people who abduct Nigerian schoolgirls? What are you going to do about the President Assads of this world? What would our God be like if you said that to him and he turned around and said nothing, really? Those things aren't that important. What sort of God would he be like if he said that? Well, he would be a very unjust and a very uncaring and a very unworthy God. And no, the Bible asks us to rejoice that our God is not like that. He will judge, but it will not be pretty. And we get some inkling of that in the symbolic language of verses 12 to 17. For those that face his anger, there will be no place to hide. Verse 17 speaks of the wrath of the Lamb, the wrath of the Lord Jesus Christ. And again, please do note these words are so significant. Please can I direct you to the last 3 or 4 words of chapter 6. In respect of this fierce and terrifying anger, who can withstand it? What is the point at issue here? Well, surely it is that if God is going to hold everyone accountable for their every action, their every word, their every thought, who can stand that sort of scrutiny? Can you honestly say that you've known anything that God will take you to will take you to task over? Never hurt anyone? You've lived entirely even up to your own standards, never mind God's perfect standards. Can you say that? Well, I can't say that. And no one has ever yet said to me that they think that they can stand before God perfectly blameless. It's very uncomfortable, isn't it? Because will you survive his fierce anger? And perhaps even more uncomfortably, and my sinful temptation is not to really believe this. Just think about a second for dear old Uncle Bill. You know Uncle Bill, getting a bit old now, slightly losing his marbles. He's lived an okay sort of life. Pillar of the community. He's been helpful, he's been caring, he's been a good dad, he's been a good husband, good employee in the company he's worked for 40 years. Will he survive God's anger? And the painful message of the Bible is, no, he won't. On the great day of the Lamb's wrath, verse 17, who can withstand it? And in a sense, it's a rhetorical question. No one can withstand the Lamb's wrath, not even dear Uncle Bill. Please will you jump with me to the beginning of chapter 8 for the 7th and final seal, just to see how awful this is. Chapter 8, verse 1, when the Lamb, which is the Lord Jesus, when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And the silence there is a deathly silence. The day of judgment will be horrific. The end of chapter 6, we are left with that question, who will survive, who will stand? And we think to ourselves, no one will stand. And then we come to chapter 7. And verse 9 of chapter 7, John says, verse 9 of chapter 7, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. So John now looks into heaven, into the command centre, at the plans and the maps and the models and the images, and he sees this huge crowd of people, bigger than he can account, who clearly have survived the day of judgment. How have they done that? Have they lived a perfect life? But we all know that's impossible. Has God lowered his standards? Has he changed his mind? No, not at all. And we're given the answer through what these people are shouting out. Verse 10, what are they shouting out? They are shouting out, verse 10, salvation, and a good definition of that word salvation is rescue. What are they shouting out? They're shouting, salvation, rescue belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Or to put that another way, God has rescued these people through the action of Jesus. Are these people enjoying eternity in the presence of God? And as we will later learn, that is an eternity without mourning, without sadness, without pain. Are they enjoying that through their own merits? Did they escape judgment through their own moral purity? No, far from it. This is all because God has chosen to rescue them, and because of the actions of Jesus. Let me just go back a second. Let me just recap with what we're seeing in this huge sweep of cosmic history. We're seeing God acting in judgment against the world and bringing, seals 1 to 4, bringing a suffering that is intended to both punish and to bring us to our senses. And a suffering that we as God's people get caught up in too, because we live in this sinful world. But a suffering that does refine us and causes us to cling to the Lord Jesus. And a suffering that we know will one day cease. How do we know this suffering will one day cease? Because at the cross, there was a suffering beyond comprehension, where the Lamb suffers the equivalent of an eternity of torment for every believer, so that we don't have to. Hence my third heading, the suffering of the Lamb. This is an imperfect illustration. I'm still working on it, but I think it works. Bear with me. I wonder whether the human body is a sort of illustration of what's going on here. Just imagine the human body for a second. In the human body, a cancerous cell can be fatal. And a surgeon will often cause pain in order to remove that destructive cancerous cell. A surgeon will sometimes cause pain not just to the cancerous cell, but to the surrounding cells and tissues. Good cells get hurt too. And sometimes the surgeon will have to be very radical and remove complete organs. My rebellious heart, your rebellious heart, our collective hearts, in them are cancers that spread. And they put the perfect life of God's creation at risk. And so the master surgeon, the Lord Jesus Christ, acts in judgment on his world with his surgeon's knife. But of course, ultimately, our condition is fatal. Unless I get a transplant. Who will provide me with a new heart? Well, what if the master surgeon were to die so that I don't have to? Hence the suffering of the world. This world is currently under the judgment of God. Hence the suffering of Christians who experience pain partly as a result of living in a sinful world, and partly who experience pain as part of God's good purposes of disciplining us. But hence also the suffering of the Lamb, who suffered on the cross so that his disciples will not do so in eternity. But there is my final heading. The great multitude in white robes. All of us know godly people who in this life love the Lord Jesus more than anything, but who are no longer with us. Those who died this life loving Jesus more than anything, what are they doing today? Those who picture language are now pure white because they have been washed in the blood of the Lamb. Where are we? We are the 11th of September. Sunday the 11th of September. That's today. Sunday the 11th of September. What are they doing? If you love Jesus more than anything, what will you be doing the second you fall off your perch? Well, we can guess, and people love to guess, don't they? But we don't need to guess. Verse 15, John sees what they are doing, what we will be doing. Verse 15, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they be hungry. Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the centre of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Brothers and sisters, do you love this Lamb? Will you persevere in holiness in this suffering world? Will you do all you can to warn others of the terrible danger they are in? But will you look forward with confidence and security and longing to the paradise that awaits you?